Thousands of listeners across the nation rely on Garden Variety to grow everything better. And we rely on listener support to sustain our little garden of knowledge. You can help Garden Variety flourish with a gift today. Donate now at ipr.org/donate.
This is Garden Variety, a horticulture podcast from Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm Charity Nebbe. Shakespeare wrote, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." What he didn't know is that one day there would be more than 30,000 cultivated varieties of roses, and each one would have a different, distinct name. He probably wouldn't have cared if he did know that. But today we are going to talk about plant names with Jeff Isles, professor of horticulture at Iowa State University. Hi, Jeff.
Charity, good morning.
So let's talk about names. When we talk about plants on the show, we throw out all of these different names. And of course, there's a common name, but there's also a scientific name. Mm-hmm. And does it feel like the scientific name is still the most important name?
It is, because you can go to any country in the world and trot out that scientific name and people will know what you're talking about. It's Latin, of course. It's the universal language. It's not a dead language. It's still very useful. But if I want to talk about a red maple to somebody from France, if I refer to Acer rubrum, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And we can thank Linnaeus for this. He was the father of modern taxonomy. So botanic names are still important, and we still use them.
And those botanic names also give you information about a plant. They don't just say, "Oh, that's a tree that I think is beautiful." They also tell you what other plants that tree is related to.
Right. So there's two parts of the binomial. The word Acer refers to plants in the genus of Acer or maples. And then the specific epithet, that second part of the binomial, is a little more specific, often refers to something about the plant. So with red maple, Acer rubrum, if you remember your high school Latin, and I'm sure you all do, refers to the color red. So it's cool. I've always been a geek for plant names. My students don't appreciate it, but I do. So.
Are you old enough to have had to take high school Latin, Jeff?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
All right.
That was a college prereq. So it was a struggle for sure.
It disappeared between you and me. All right. Let's talk about cultivars, because, of course, cultivars are the cultivated varieties of plants. When we go to the plant store and we see all of these names on all the pots that we with plants in it that we covet, we see both usually that scientific name, but then we also see the cultivar name. What do those mean?
Right. So back in the day, probably in the 1930s and 1940s, we began to assign cultivar names to plants. One of the very first shade tree cultivars was a honey locust called moraine, which was patented in 1949. And so if you found a unique individual and wanted to propagate it and also recoup some money for all the time you invested in bringing that plant to market, then you would patent the cultivar name, and the patent would last for 20 years. And after that, you'd lose control of your intellectual property, but at least for those 20 years, you'd receive royalties. And so Crimson King Norway maple is another cultivar from 1947. So these were important. Now we've gone one step further, and I think you alluded to that in a minute. We can go there, but cultivars really came into the fore probably in the 1940s and 1950s.
And the cultivar name, even after the patent wore off, the cultivar name sticks around, right?
Cultivar name sticks around, but you lose control. Nobody's going to pay your royalties anymore for moraine honey locust, which came out of a nursery in Ohio, and so they derive great benefit from that plant for many years. Now it's just out in the trade, and you can propagate and sell it without paying royalties anymore.
Can it also then drift? Can that cultivar name refer to something that isn't true to the original cultivar?
Well, there's some chicanery that goes on out there, but generally it sticks with the plant. And I should say at this point, there has been some controversy with cultivar names. There is a crabapple called Indian Magic that came out of a nursery in Vincennes, Indiana. Robert Simpson was the introducer, and he was a big fan of the ponies. He liked horse racing. And so he named this crabapple after a racehorse, an Arabian racehorse. Some will say we should be changing the names of some of these plants, Indian magic, for example, because they appear to be appropriating culture, in this case of Native Americans. But that's not what Bob had in mind. He had in mind a horse. So there is some controversy with plant naming.
Although that also gives us a little bit of a window into how haphazard these cultivar names may be when they are assigned. So the person who comes up with this cultivar gets to pick the name with really no bounds?
No, I mean, they can call it whatever they want. In fact, I have an example that will use your name here in a minute. But the step that goes one step further is that after people started to realize that they'd lose control of their intellectual property after the patent wore out, a lot of nurseries began to trademark their plants. Trademarks are not plant names. They were never meant to be plant names, but as you go to the nursery today, they're often used as plant names. The cool thing about a trademark, if I'm a plant introducer, is that they can be renewed every 10 years. So I never lose control of the name that I use. It always stays with that plant, and I can continue to derive benefit, financial benefit, by trademarking a plant. So I hope that most nurseries have plant labels that have both the cultivar name and the trademark, which alleviates any confusion.
Can you give me an example of a trademark? Are there plants that we refer to by their trademark?
Right. So the most recognizable one is a maple, and its cultivar name is Jeffers Red. It was named after a guy by the name of Glenn Jeffers in Fostoria, Ohio, but it was trademarked Autumn Blaze. So Autumn Blaze maple is ubiquitous in the nursery trade. It's one of the most popular shade trees in the state of Iowa, if not the Midwest. But the true name of that plant is Jeffers Red, trademark Autumn Blaze. Oftentimes people just refer to the plant as Autumn Blaze maple, and that violates trademark law. Not that we're going to get too deep into the weeds here. But so anyway, on a plant label, I want to see both cultivar name and the trademark.
Oh, interesting. But Jeffers Red could have been both the cultivar name and the trademark, couldn't it?
No, that also violates the naming laws. So
do horticulturists have to go to law school and take Latin, Jeff? My goodness.
It's rather confusing. And imagine the poor homeowner that sees this gobbledygook on a plant label and they wonder, what the heck is this?
Yeah, they don't pay any attention to it. They just put in their tree with the pretty red foliage in the fall.
Well, let me use an example here using your name. So what if you discover a white oak and it's unique and you want to propagate it and sell it? So you might call that plant Quercus alba, which is the botanic name for white oak. You might give it the cultivar name Nebby. So Quercus alba Nebby is the true name of this plant. But who's going to, no offense to your surname, it's a wonderful surname.
My parents are listening. They're going to be offended, Jeff.
But it doesn't have enough pizzazz. I mean,
no, you're right. It lacks pizzazz. Yeah.
So you might decide to use a trademark to identify that plant. And maybe you call it Charity's Chariot or Charity's Charmer or Charity's Chili Dog. I don't know. You decide on the trademark, but you can see how that has much more market appeal.
Right.
And you maintain control of that trademark forever, in essence, as long as it doesn't become generic, which means that if people start referring to your plant as Charity's Chariot and they forget that the real name is Nebby, then you could lose control of the trademark.
Okay.
That rarely happens.
Although I suspect that Mr. Jeffers is probably not unhappy with the incredible success of his Autumn Blaze.
Well, he passed away quite a while ago,
okay.
and he gave the rights to a nursery in Illinois, sold the rights, but I'm sure it made a ton of money. Just one of the more successful plant stories in modern horticulture.
Right, and you recommend that people don't plant it because there are too many of them all over the place, right?
I'm not going to tell your listeners what to do, but we do know that we've overrepresented maples in the Iowa landscape, and especially this particular cultivar. So, yeah, we should probably start mixing things up a bit.
All right. Well, that's an aside because we're talking about names here. And I can imagine that for a horticulturist, for somebody who is breeding plants and developing cultivars, having your name on a plant feels really special.
Oh, it's cool. It's very special, and it lives on for a long time. Let me give you another example. There's a new Buckeye in the trade, and it was named after the guy that discovered it. His name was Aaron, so the cultivar name of this Buckeye is Aaron 1. I don't know what 1 stands for. But the introducer also gave it a trademark called Mystic Ruby. So Mystic Ruby Buckeye is what you'll see in the trade. It has a red flower. But the introducer's wife liked Van Morrison. And, of course, there's a famous Van Morrison tune called Into the Mystic, and so that's where Mystic Ruby comes from. So there's always a backstory to some of these names.
Well, and when I'm at the nursery, sometimes I do wonder, where did this come from? You've made the case the scientific names are extremely important. The trademark, that's extremely important. These cultivars, we have to have these names so we know what we're talking about. But I still would argue that this is kind of a haphazard system, but it's really important, isn't it?
Unfortunately, the nursery industry, and I grew up in the industry, I love the industry, but they sometimes use nonsensical cultivar names because they realize that it's the trademark that carries the day. Let me give you an example of an oak. There's an oak that has the cultivar name JFS-KW2QX. That's the name of the plant. It's nonsensical. The trademark is skinny jeans. So this is an upright growing
That's also
oak.
nonsensical.
Well, but it's a play on words. So the word jeans is spelled with a G.
Oh, okay.
So get it?
Yep.
So it's a columnar growing oak that has this trademark skinny jeans and a nonsensical cultivar name. And it's kind of annoying. I long for the old days where we just called things by their cultivar names. But again, I'm not in the business of making money. So there's a coffee tree, Kentucky coffee tree called Skinny Latte. That's its trademark. That's kind of creative. And there's a new flowering pear. We're kind of down on flowering pears because they're invasive plants. But there's a gentleman, researcher in North Carolina that introduced one that's sterile. And he uses the trademark Chastity pear, which is rather creative, don't you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And communicates a lot with just a short message.
Yep.
Jeff Isles, professor of horticulture at Iowa State University. For more gardening information and tips, you can subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Find out more at iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. Garden Variety is a production of Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension. It's produced by me, Erin Stile, Caitlin Troutman, and the Iowa Public Radio talk show team. For more garden goodness, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Just go to iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. See you next time.